Protests underway. This is the 8th night of protests. Demonstrators demanding justice and change in this country after the death of George Floyd. The protests peaceful today, but there is concern with nightfall now approaching. Here in New York City, thousands are in the streets, several marches, one massive group, it's now believed, headed to Gracie Mansion, the mayor's residence. A new 8 p.m. curfew in place now. It is quickly approaching after last night's 11 p.m. curfew was hardly effective. It's believed tens of thousands are on the march in Los Angeles at this hour, several different locations. In Washington, D.C., as we come on, thousands, it's believed, now headed toward the Lincoln Memorial. There is a massive march and rally in Houston tonight, George Floyd's hometown. And of course, all of this comes as authorities brace for the night ahead. Last night after dark, a violent turn here in New York City. Many storefronts destroyed, famous landmarks too. The famed Macy's department store, as I mentioned tonight, that curfew has now been moved up. 6 police officers shot overnight, 4 of them in St. Louis. They all survived. 2 officers in Las Vegas. One of them is now on life support. And tensions high again tonight in Washington, D.C. after Park Police cleared those peaceful protesters with flashbangs, one striking a cameraman from Australian TV. That image was being fed live back to Australia. Broadcasters there were stunned. Minutes later, after that scene, the president walking through the park to St. John's Episcopal Church to hold up a Bible. Asked if it was his, he said, "It's a Bible." Tonight, the fallout from that moment and the competing images, the peaceful protests across the country, and the concerns about what this nation saw overnight when the sun went down. ABC's Stephanie Ramos leads us off again tonight from right here in New York.
Today, the images of protest from across the country just hours before new curfews go into effect. From San Francisco to Orlando to New York City, thousands marching in protest with a message of peace.
We are not looking to agitate or to loot or destroy anything. We are trying to make the community unified, and by doing that, it's not unifying the community, it's breaking it apart.
The city now moving up its curfew to 8 o'clock tonight after a 4th night of looting. Peaceful demonstration by day replaced with a vicious cycle of violence overnight. Windows smashed, stores ransacked from the Macy's flagship store to Rockefeller Center.
The sun has gone down here in New York City, and there are clearly different groups that are out here facing off with police, shattering windows here along Fifth Avenue.
The governor today blasting the mayor and police department.
And the police in New York City were not effective at doing their job last night. Period. They have to do a better job. But separate the protesters from the looting.
Hundreds of arrests, most after curfew. Police investigating this video showing a car slamming into an officer in a hit and run in the Bronx. That officer in serious condition.
It appears to be quite purposeful. That's unacceptable.
Overnight, officers shot during violent protests in Las Vegas, one in grave condition. Another 4 officers were shot in St. Louis.
Thank God, they're alive. They're alive. But what? Can we make some sense out of this?
Across the country, police tactics under scrutiny. LA's police chief sparking outrage after suggesting looters were as responsible for George Floyd's death as those fired police officers.
We had people mourning the death of this man, George Floyd. We had people capitalizing. His death is on their hands, as much as it is those officers.
The chief later apologizing, calling his own words terribly offensive. Today, LA officers kneeling with protesters at a faith-based march. At times, police torn between patrol and protest. This officer in D.C. seen trying to kneel, only to be repeatedly pulled to his feet by his fellow officers. In Detroit, 16-year-old organizer Stephen Perez has been urging his fellow demonstrators to abide by the city's curfew.
They home safe. They don't got rubber bullets. They don't got tear gas. They're not dead.
The mayor calling to thank him.
When I saw your leadership, I have tears in my eyes. You are everything that's special about the city of Detroit.
That young protester telling others to go home at curfew. Stephanie Ramos back with us here in New York. We see the large crowd behind you, Stephanie. We also know that curfew now goes into effect just a short time from now, 8 p.m., but a lot of protesters said they're not concerned about that.
That's absolutely right, David. City. You can see them here. It will be very difficult to enforce this new curfew. This group, we've been following them for several blocks. They actually just got started a little while ago.
All right, Stephanie Ramos with us again tonight from the streets of New York. Stephanie, thank you. Now to the fallout from the president's visit to St. John's Episcopal Church just after we were on the air last night here. The Park Police firing flashbangs, smoke canisters, pepper balls at peaceful demonstrators, apparently to clear the way for the president. We have learned it was Attorney General William Barr who gave the order. Tonight, church leaders are now expressing outrage. So are leaders in both parties. And here's our chief White House correspondent, Jonathan Karl.
As President Trump rode through Washington today, citizens, including families with homemade signs, jeered the presidential limousine. We were in the motorcade watching the people, their signs withering. Are you a moral monster? I can't breathe. Today, outrage is growing over the forceful removal of peaceful protesters to clear the way for the president to hold a photo op at St. John's Church. It all began shortly after 6 p.m., the hour before Washington's curfew took effect. The protesters had gathered just a block from the White House gate. As the president prepared to speak in the Rose Garden, our camera spotted Attorney General Bill Barr surveying the scene. ABC News has learned the Attorney General then gave the order to remove the protesters by force. And so it began, continuing even as the president was saying these words.
I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters.
You could hear the explosions from the Rose Garden, the police using flashbang, smoke canisters, and pepper balls to force the protesters away. Among those roughed up, an Australian TV crew, the photographer hit in the face, his colleague hit with a baton as she tried to flee. After he was done speaking, the president, accompanied by his top advisors, walked to St. John's Church, crossing the street where the protesters had gathered less than an hour earlier. In front of the church, the president held up a Bible. He summoned his advisors to pose for a photo before heading back to the White House. Among the first to express outrage, the Bishop of Washington, the spiritual leader of Episcopalians in the nation's capital, including the parishioners at St. John's.
But he is not entitled to use the spiritual symbolism of our sacred spaces and our sacred texts to promote or to justify a entirely different message.
The condemnation stretched across the political spectrum, including prominent Republicans.
If your question is, should you use tear gas to clear a path so the president can go have a photo op, the answer is no.
Republican Senator Ben Sasse said, quote, I'm against clearing out a peaceful protest for a photo op that treats the word of God as a political prop. Even Pat Robertson, prominent televangelist and an ardent supporter of President Trump, had harsh words for the president.
And it seems like now is the time to say, I understand your pain. I want to comfort you. I think it's time we love each other. But the president took a different course.
Robertson lambasted the president for threatening to move military troops into American cities unless the nation's governors control the violence.
Matter of fact, he spoke of them as being jerks. You just don't do that, Mr. President. It isn't cool.
So let's get to John Karl back with us again tonight from the White House. John, I know you were in the motorcade today witnessing those protesters, their signs. The president, though, unwavering on this tonight. And also this evening, a former president now weighing in, John?
Former President George W. Bush out with a powerful statement that condemns the, quote, brutal suffocation of George Floyd and says many doubt the justice of our country, and with good reason. President Bush does not mention President Trump by name, but he does express support for the protesters, saying, quote, those who set out to silence those voices do not understand the meaning of America or how it becomes a better place. That's President George W. Bush tonight, David.
All right, John Karl.